Welcome back. Today we'll be discussing the rise of the medieval culture, and then in subsequent lectures we'll look at uh, medieval culture that produced the great Gothic cathedrals, and then the transition from medieval culture to the Renaissance. First, ask yourself, what is your image of the Middle Ages or the medieval period? And I'll tell you the exact dates in a few minutes. When I ask this in class, most students quite understandably say castles, knights in armor, feudalism, peasants, kings, and whatnot. And those are all very, very valid images. This photo, we see a painting from the time of a castle in the background, as you can see, with the towers, the defenses, and in the foreground we see peasants sowing grains to produce crops and plowing the fields. Now, the Middle Ages are often referred to as the Dark Ages. The word dark in this connotation means nothing was happening. They were ignorant people, uncivilized. And the general time period we're referring to is from the fall of the Western Roman Empire, as we've seen previously, which is in the 5th century, until the Renaissance, which began around 1400. So we have approximately 1,000-year period that subsequently, during the Renaissance and afterwards, people look back on and said, well, there wasn't much happening there. The great cities during the Roman Empire went into decline, and people were barbaric and, quote, ignorant, and they call it the Dark Ages, particularly comparing the period of time to the Renaissance. Well, I think what I try and show you today, they really weren't the Dark Ages, and over the last few decades, historians have stopped referring them to the Dark Ages and referred to them as the Middle Ages. There was a lot of intellectual activity going on, a lot of creativity. During this period, there were not very large cities like we saw in the Roman Empire, and we'll see later in the Renaissance, but rather the learning was centered largely in monasteries, and we'll talk about those at length in a few minutes. And what we're going to focus on for our purposes is how religion, art, architecture, and music were all intertwined in the culture of the period. Now, just to look at the general time periods, and these beginning and ending dates are very approximate. Roughly 500, the fall of the Western Roman Empire was in the 400s, to about the year 1000 is referred to the early Middle Ages. The next 300 years, the High Middle Ages, and then approximately 1300 to 1400, 1450 are the late Middle Ages, which merge into the early Renaissance. For many people who have studied this period, many historians, now Charlemagne was a descendant of the Franks who ruled the area of modern-day Germany and part of France and part of northern Italy. In the year 800, he wanted to bring back the order of the Roman Empire, so the Pope crowned Charlemagne as the Holy Roman Emperor. And this lasted for several hundred years under Charlemagne and his descendants. And this was an attempt to unify all of Western Europe under Christianity. And in the course module, there's a very good video on the process of setting up the Holy Roman Empire empire and how it succeeded. And Charlemagne is also worth discussing because he established feudalism, which was an economic system that underlay the economics and politics and the culture of the Middle Ages. Now, as I mentioned before, there was a great decline in cities during the Middle Ages. And so essentially you had agricultural society, and this society was very hierarchical, and it was based on land holdings. Wealth came from land holdings. It was a static society. There was no social mobility to speak of. And so you had the king at the very top, the king who was blessed by the Pope. And while the king was not considered divine or a god, he ruled with the consent of God through the Pope. And now the king gave land to his supporters. His senior supporters were the noble class. He gave large tracts of land to them, and the nobles then were required to repay the king by paying rent and providing knights to fight for the king in various wars. Now, how did the nobles get the money to pay the rent? Well, they went to the peasants who lived for many generations in the same area, continued to live there. There was virtually no physical mobility for the vast majority of the people. Most people, their great-grandparents and their grandchildren would never leave 10 or 15 miles from where they were born. The serfs or the peasants worked the land day to day, just as they had for hundreds of years. But under feudalism, they were considered to be renting the land from the noble, and so they had to give the noble so much of their grain by working 3 or 4 days of the week on the land of the noble or the produce from them for 3 or 4 days a week. They weren't slaves in the sense that they bought and sold, but they couldn't physically move, or marry without the permission of the noble. The whole system of feudalism was gradually undermined, as we'll see later in the course, by the growth of the cities, where the wealth now and political power didn't depend so much on land and agriculture, but rather on business. Now, the Holy Roman Empire was centered in what's now northern Germany, the city of Aachen, which is between modern-day France and Germany. And the kingdom covered much of Western Europe, which we'll see on the next slide. Here we can see in green the Holy Roman Empire. It's also called the Carolingian world. And you can see up in the above modern-day Frankfurt, Cologne, the medieval city of Aachen. This is where it was headquartered. And it goes into France and then down into much of Italy. One thing that's noticeable about the Holy Roman Empire is that it was very tolerant of Jews. Jews were persecuted throughout Europe, from the latter part of the Roman Empire right up actually up through Adolf Hitler trying to find the final solution in the 1930s and early 1940s under the Third Reich in Germany. And we'll talk a little more about the Jewish persecution later in the course, but it was significant at the time that Jews were not generally persecuted in the Holy Roman Empire. Here we have a slide of the chapel. We don't have the entire church standing. Most of it has long been destroyed, but we have the chapel, the side chapel of the Aachen Chapel Church, where Charlemagne worshipped. And if this is just a side chapel, you can imagine what the church itself was like. As I mentioned a few moments ago, the monasteries were really the center of much of the life and culture of this period. Now, monastery is simply a building, a location where monks live. It comes from the Greek word mono, which means single, because the monks do not marry, they do not have families, and they also practice self-denial and solitary living. By self-denial, in many self-sacrifices, wear plain clothes, they eat very simple food, something like modern day oatmeal, work constantly. And the monks are not priests. The priests in the church at that time, and would continue into the Roman Catholic Church of today, are ordained. They say the Mass. The monks are part of the clergy, but they, like nuns, do not say the Mass and are not ordained. And as you've read in the textbook, the monks, virtually all of them, lived under St. Benedict's rule, and St. Benedict set up the model monastery system and the rules. And they were essentially, you pray, you work, and you study when you're not sleeping, and you don't sleep very many hours. And you can see in the textbook a schedule for a monastery, and it's incredibly grueling. Up hours and hours before dawn to pray, to work in the kitchen, then have a meager breakfast. It's 3 or 4 hours later, and the entire day is taken up with work, study, and prayer. The part of self-denial of the monks was to live in poverty. They didn't wander around. They were not missionaries, and they practiced chastity, and they had no marriage. And the women were nuns, but there were many, many more men as monks. Now, their work consisted of what you might imagine as normal work in a monastery, working in the small fields to produce grain, harvesting the grain, taking care of a few animals, working in the kitchen, washing clothes, etc., etc. But beyond those tasks that were necessary for life, their main job was to copy and what's called illuminate or illustrate religious manuscripts. Here we have a painting from the time of the idealized life of monks, and you can see the monks are there with quill pens made from feathers and ink and copying religious manuscripts. Now this, of course, is before the age of the modern printing press, which we'll look at later in the course. And so every copy of every book had to be hand copied. And this is an example of how Bibles and other religious documents were beautifully, beautifully produced by the monks. It might take a monk 5 or 10 years to completely copy a Bible. And you can see the writing. It looks almost like it was printed, but it was hand written. And what's most amazing are the illustrations. And if you make a mistake, you simply start the page over. And this is all done on parchment or sheepskin. Here we have another example. As you can see here on both pages, there's far more illustration than text. The page on our left has no text, and the one on our right has very few words. And another illustration here. If you ever have the opportunity to see these middle-age Bibles or documents in person in a museum, you should definitely avail yourself of the opportunity, because while these high-definition photos are impressive, there's nothing like seeing it in person. The gold in the text here, or the drawings, is actually pure gold that's put in the ink, and there's great attention paid for detail. Now, the monasteries began essentially for priests, as I mentioned, to pray, to copy religious documents, and they were sort of self-contained. But then with the cities dissolving, they really evolved into the civic center for the neighborhood. When travelers came by, there were no hotels then, so the monks would often take travelers in, give them food and a bed. They also became the hospitals of sort for the poor peasants nearby, where they would have a bed. There might be a fireplace in the room. And remember, in Northern Europe, it gets very cold for like 7 months of the year. They'd be given food. And they also had special rooms for bloodletting, which was one of the predominant medical treatments from the time of Aristotle and the ancient Greeks all the way up until 150 years ago, including in the United States 150 years ago. And this was part of the medical theory that disorders were caused by an imbalance of the four humors or balances in the body, and to relieve people from fevers. That meant that it was too much blood, so they would take a small incision or use a small insect, a leech, to make an incision in your arm or leg and have a cup or two of blood come out. And this obviously sometimes killed the patients or made them much worse, but this was the predominant medical treatment. And in the monasteries, they also had courts to resolve both religious disputes, and then the civic courts if farmers claimed that they were being mistreated by the nobles or whatever. Now, the farmers were largely producing grains, and the grains need to be stored because once they harvest the grains in the early fall, they can make some of the grain into bread and eat it immediately. Obviously, bread does not keep very long, as any of us know who've gone to the store. You buy the bread. If you just leave it out on the countertop, it doesn't last very long. Nowadays, if you buy more, you can stick some in the freezer, but they didn't have the option then. So, like the ancient Egyptians, what they would often do is take the excess grain and they would brew it into beer. And to mill the grain, to grind it, and to brew it, takes a lot of capital investment, and poor farmers couldn't do that, so the monks did that. So they set up mills. The farmers would bring their grain. The monks would help them mill it, grind it, and the monks would be paid grain from the farmers. And then they also set up large breweries to brew beer. And this was a way of preserving the grain. And as I mentioned earlier in the course when we were looking at Egypt, to this very day, the German word for beer means liquid bread. And this was a way to preserve the nutritional value of the grains in a substance that did not deteriorate because of the alcohol. And you'll recall that the Egyptian hieroglyph for food consists of two other hieroglyphs, grain and beer, put together. Here's an example from my local supermarket of St. Arnold's beer. St. Arnold is, to this very day, the so-called patron saint of beer makers. And this is because Arnold was a saint in the Middle Ages, and his monastery was well known for producing beer. I took this ad off of the internet. This is an actual German monastery today where a German beer company, I've never heard of this beer, I can't even pronounce it, Weihenstephan, because of the long tradition of monks with beer production. they have this advertisement. But even today, you can go to some of the large monasteries in Germany, and you can see bright stainless steel facilities for beer breweries right there next to the monastery. Now, St. Gall in the Middle Ages um, came up with his idea for an ideal monastery. This is the original plan on a piece of parchment, which is too difficult for us to read. Here we have a simplified sketch, and if you look at it, you can see you have the church in the middle, in the upper part. You have courtyards, you have granaries, you have cemeteries, you have the brewery, you have a little hospital, and everything else. This is easier to visualize. This is, I'm sorry, it's in French, but this is an abbey of St. Gall. This is a monastery. You can see the church in the center. You can see around the church the dining room. You can see the boulangerie is the bakery. You can see the cemetery. You can see a little hospital. You can see a small school for the peasant children. You can see the granary, a building to dry fruit. So it's a small civic center right there in the monastery. Now, one important aspect of the monastery was music, and this was central to the monastic life. The monks used what was called Gregorian chants, and they would pray while singing. And this was sung a cappella, which you probably know means without musical accompaniment. Every syllable has its own note, and so the structure of the music is dominated by the words of the prayer they are saying. And there's a video in the module from YouTube, which I encourage you to open. You can just listen to a minute or two, and you can hear these Gregorian chants. And the monks spent much of the day chanting. They would walk around and pray, or when it was particularly cold or after religious services, they go into churches and chant. And when you had many monks chanting, it produced beautiful, beautiful music. And that's one reason they started to build the higher ceilings in the churches, was because you get better acoustics. And to this very day, if you go to large churches near monasteries in Europe, they have signs as certain hours every day you can go in and listen to the monks chanting. And it's very nice because they usually do it in the early evening, and to provide a medieval atmosphere, they turn out all the lights and they only use candles. So it's very dark, but you can almost imagine you're back there 700 or 800 years. Now, pilgrims are people going on a pilgrimage for religious reasons. And there was a great increase in the number of pilgrims in Western Europe because in the 10th and 11th centuries, warfare decreased, the roads became safer, and so you had pilgrims spending many, many weeks traveling by foot to religious sites, largely in Spain, England, Italy, and particularly to the Middle East, the Holy Land, to Jerusalem. Now, the pilgrims were going to these religious sites to pray in churches that had the relics of various saints. And we've talked about this before. A relic for the Christians then was usually the bone of a saint, or it could have been a bit of wood from the cross that Christ was crucified on. Something that belonged to a very holy person, a saint in the church. And so, in fact, many churches were dedicated just for a certain relic. So many people still go to pilgrimages today, and particularly many Americans through travel agents go to northern Spain or France on various pilgrimages. There were also the Crusades during this time period, which were efforts to recapture holy places, starting with Jerusalem in the Middle East, that had been taken over by Muslims. And there are several videos in the module that will explain in greater detail the background of the Crusades and the impact they had on societies. So with the greatly increased number of pilgrims, the monks started building large pilgrimage churches, as well as hostels or small hotels on the pilgrim routes. The arts at this time became almost exclusively religious, and the message was life on earth is but a test, and those who live a righteous life and worship and pray to Christ would have the eternal reward of heaven. This is, of course, the message of religion then, Christian religion in Western Europe, and that we'll see time and time again in the art throughout the course. I already discussed the illuminated or illustrated books. Now, in terms of architecture, we have what's the so-called Romanesque style. These were very heavy buildings, very large buildings with thick walls, heavy stone arches, and a lot of exterior decoration, relatively little interior. And the sculptures were largely relief sculptures. Relief sculptures are not sculptures that three-dimensional that you can walk around, but rather they are carved and cemented to the wall. This style became known as Romanesque because it was larger architecture, and for the people at the time, they thought it resembled classical Rome. Because the early medieval centuries, from roughly 500, year 500 to roughly 1000, there were very small churches, but now people wanted to go back to the glory of Rome, so they built larger buildings. They wanted to open up the interior spaces with the architectural techniques at this time. That required heavy walls, very, very thick walls, and small windows. And we'll see that changing in the next lecture when, through improved architectural techniques, they built the beautiful Gothic cathedrals such as Notre Dame in Paris. And the walls had to be heavy also to provide more support, because now they wanted to make fireproof roofs, and they wanted to make those roofs, therefore, of stone or concrete, which weighed much, much more than wood or straw, and the weight had to be supported by the walls. There was relatively little sculpture in the churches, freestanding or 360-degree sculpture, but what little sculpture there was cemented to the walls. The most interesting sculpture was the decoration around the exterior doors of the church, the doors that people would use, obviously, to enter the church. And what we're going to look at now is this semicircular space above cathedral doors. This is called the tympanum. And here we have an example of a very famous tympanum from the Middle Ages, which shows Christ in the middle on the Day of Judgment. And there is a video in the module which I encourage you to watch, because it has wonderful close-ups of many of these figures that we see in this slide. But what you can see is Christ in the middle at the Last Judgment, when the decision will be made whether people go to heaven or hell. And you can see the depiction of Christ. It's not very realistic. In fact, the proportions are all wrong. But the goal here isn't to have naturalism, moved away from that. The goal is to teach people a religious lesson. And we have, looking at this, on our right, on Christ's left, we have the devils pulling people and they're going to hell. And on the left, we have heaven. Just to the right of Christ, you can see, and you can see this much better in the video, a scale of justice with the Archangel Michael there weighing the soul. Again, this will remind you of what the ancient Egyptians did with the ka, or the soul. And to the right of the scale, you have devils, and there's one little devil there trying to put a stone in the basket so the person would be deemed going to hell. But the idea of this was, as people would enter the church, they'd look at this. Most people, the vast majority of people, were illiterate. A priest or a monk or a nun would explain these scenes to people, and it was referred to as their stone sermon, or carved sermon, and explain what would happen if you don't live the righteous life, and be told going through the doors and seeking through the church the good life would lead to the happy outcome of heaven. As I mentioned, the goal here is not naturalism, realism, but it's didactic, it's teaching. And the scenes were harsh reminders of the afterlife. What happens? And what's the message? You need to enter the church, repent your sins, prayer, and then take action for salvation. Now here in Toulouse in southern France, we have a very large church, and you can see in this aerial photograph that it's built on the Roman basilica design, and you can see it looks like the Christian cross. It's a very large church. You can look at the size of the cars nearby and you can see just how large it is. But you'll notice the windows are very small and the walls are very, very thick and massive. This is the same church. This is a view of the front entrance. Again, you can see very, very small windows in the wall, with the exception of the large round or rose window right above the front door. You can see it's very plain on the outside. It's not very much decorated. And what decoration there is almost exclusively around the entrance doors. This is an interior view of the same church, and you can see. Finally, just like to, another very prevalent form of art then was tapestry, and women of all social classes were involved in weaving and embroidering and sewing, and they would often sit together, so you could have a very wealthy aristocratic woman sitting around the table with poor women, and they were producing beautiful tapestries, largely for the glory of God. The most important item for the women to produce were the vestments that priests wore at church during religious services, and these were made of the very finest cloths. Many times the threads were made of actual gold and silver and had actual pearls on them. Other tapestries were made to celebrate very important historical events. One famous tapestry is known as the Bayeux Tapestry, which is about 2 feet high and 230 feet long. It's really tremendous. And you can see this tapestry in northern France. It's very near the beaches in Normandy, where the D-Day landings took place in World War II. And they've actually built a museum, and a large circular museum, and this tapestry just goes all the way around in a circle. What it does is it describes the invasion of England in 1066 by William the Conqueror, which, as you certainly have studied, was one of the most important events in English history. And the tapestry provides a narrative history from William's decision to invade England to his final victory. And here we have a scene, and there's a very short video in the module that animates it and actually has the figures move, and it explains in 4 or 5 minutes the major events on the tapestry. And finally, we have this close-up of one of the figures in this 230-foot long tapestry, and you can see the gold there. These are actual gold fibers that are woven in. Okay, and then in the next lecture, we're going to move on to the Gothic period. Thank you.